I want to begin by just talking about two themes that I have been working on amazingly over the past 2 decades that relate to questions of medieval performance. And I have always been interested in the ephemeral, that which doesn't survive, and the investment that was made during the period that I work on. I describe the period as the long 15th century. And in fact, my work spans the traditional categories of medieval, late medieval, and Renaissance. And I prefer this idea of the long 15th century. It captures more accurately the historical period. So the investment during this time in ephemeral performance, but also how 15th century painters could design a tapestry or a panel painting one day, and then design tableau vivant for a procession or a banquet interlude on another day. Painters who could apply paint to craft exquisite drapery and faces on panel, parchment, or paper on one day, and no doubt just as exquisitely on a shield, banner, or wax figure on another. Mapping these connections has been an important part of my research to, at the same time, contextualize these objects and the work of these artists within a larger performance culture. When we have, in fact, focused on what the accidents of history and the durability of certain materials have retained in the art historical record. The way that art history has traditionally been told has privileged one medium over another. And I've been involved in trying to think about visual culture in broader terms. So the second theme that I've been thinking a great deal about is that this long 15th century is the time in which pictures survive that have been purported to document theater. And in fact, the way that theater history has been told has been through these pictures. And this has struck me recently as a topic that I wanted to return to. It was one that I wrote about at length in the last book that Justine mentioned. And I've wanted to return it because I've found that pictures have not only been invoked as evidence for what the medieval theater looked like, but this post-photography confidence that what we see in them has a direct relationship to its referent has become more and more pronounced with our reliance on PowerPoint. We know that photographs can be manipulated, photoshopped, decontextualized, but this model of looking continues. And I'm convinced that our turn to PowerPoint has reinforced it even more. So even if a disclaimer is added to an image, and even if we are all suspicious of the ways that digital and analog photos lie, the very presence of pictures on the screen as backdrop creates a link between that picture and the subject discussed. So we're becoming trained more and more to see pictures as illustrations. In our attempt to imagine the kind of large-scale medieval urban performances during the long 15th century, the paucity of surviving examples has strengthened the investment in a few pictures as visual aid, as proof of what it looked like. So this evening, I want to return to two of the most well-known pictures and to explore the interpretive problems that they pose for understanding medieval performance culture. But I also want to focus your attention on them by taking the time to look at these spectacular and familiar pictures. I hope to help you see them differently. The first picture is this one, a full-page miniature depicting the martyrdom of Saint Apollonia. Art historians have associated it with Jean Fouquet, a name that appears in a note in another manuscript, where the artist is described as a royal painter to the French king, Louis XI. Jean Fouquet also appears in the account books of Tours, a city in the Loire Valley, in the 1460s and 70s. The page once formed part of a luxury book of hours, a devotional prayer book made around 1460 for Etienne Chevalier, a high-ranking civil servant who served as secretary and treasurer for King Charles VII, Louis XI's predecessor. And this is to an opening page from this book of hours that depicts the donor Etienne Chevalier on the left and the Virgin and Child on the right. And it's the beginning of matins for the office of the Virgin, and we can see the text that's been cropped out at the bottom, Domine mea labia mea apries, Lord, open my lips, and then continuing, and my mouth will proclaim your praise. This picture would have been situated within the section of the book devoted to the suffrages of the saints and preceded the prayers to Saint Apollonia, people often invoked her intercession to relieve themselves of suffering from illnesses resulting in toothaches. The Book of Hours was dismantled in the 18th century, the illuminations separated and framed. 40 of them, including this picture that we're going to discuss, were purchased by a German collector and then sold in 1891 to the Duc d'Aumale. To this day, they hang inframed on the walls of a chapel in his residence, the Castle of Chantilly, outside of Paris, now the Musée Condé. The scholarly reception of this picture has similarly dismantled and reframed the miniature within a history of medieval theater. Again and again, this picture functions as a stand-in for what a medieval theater would have looked like. Reproduced in histories of medieval drama, it has become the reference point as well as evidence for the existence of a medieval theater, one in which walls or barriers created a circular enclosure, a theater in the round built to house plays. What we see, accordingly, is this structure, this round building, cut down the middle to display its interior, like an apple cut in half. Let's put this image and analogy aside and turn our attention to the picture. The composition is divided into 3 distinct registers, separated by different color palettes, scale, the materials and techniques they engage and evoke, and the nature of their spatial and temporal illusionism. The lower register is separated from the central register by a semicircular hedge above a trellis of interlaced branches. Golden wild men and women are placed against the trellis. They are the largest in terms of scale of the figures in the 3 registers. They hold the marks of the book's owner, Master Etienne Chevalier, his cipher EE, and the beginning of the prayer to Saint Apollonia, beginning with the initial B, Beata. The application of paint evokes golden metalwork figurines. Although slight shadow suggests volume, the illusion of space is collapsed. The figures appear set against the strip of green and patterned trellis. Heraldic emblems placed on the page, decorative elements that call attention to its flatness. These figures invite us to read the page as a surface for the written text. We are prompted to engage in a different optical exercise as we move upwards to the central register. There, we are asked to read an illusion of space on the parchment surface. The central register depicts the torture of Saint Apollonia. Most accounts identify her as the legendary virgin saint, martyred in Alexandria under the Emperor Decius because she refused to pray to his idols. She met her end by willingly jumping into the fire built to scare her into renouncing Christianity. But before that, her torture had included having her teeth ripped out, hence her becoming the patron saint of toothaches. This is the moment the picture relates. The saint lies on a plank, wearing a dress, form-fitting at the bodice, cinched at the waist, and one shade whiter than her neck and face. Her hands bound and her body is secured to the rack with golden ropes. The emperor stands behind her, holding his scepter in one hand, pointing to the saint with the other. One of her tormentors holds a pair of enormous pincers to her mouth. Two others strain with the effort to tighten the ropes just above her ankles. A third grasps her golden hair on the left. Clothed in matching pastels of pink and green with hats of vibrant blue, the four figures create a sense of dynamic motion. Their combined effort swiveling the rack. The repetition of the colors of their clothing enhances this circular motion, suggesting an endless cycle of revolutions. A fool, larger in scale, with his golden bauble, exposes his rear end. Also appearing larger in scale, a seventh figure, clothed in the same vibrant blue and pastel pink of the others, holds a book and baton. The ground plan of the central register is tilted downward. The figures slant as if positioned on a hill. It gives us the entirety of the scene. This is the action in vibrant color on display. The top register shifts color palette from the bright pastels and vibrant blue to a burnished copper with golden highlights. The perspective also shifts from the slanted ground plane of the central register to a forward-facing plane of a series of platforms on which the figures occupy a narrow ledge. These golden figurines recall the golden figures in the lower register, creating a visual parallel and joining the top and bottom of the page. Yet if one evokes the mass and weight of the goldsmith's craft, those below, the figures above suggest a polychromed gilt sculpture in relief. These figures are composed with sketch-like lines, hints of details highlighted with darker shades of blue, red, and green. We have to work to make sense of them. As our eyes adjust, we become aware of the incredible attention to detail in the application of single lines. The figures are seated, standing, or lounging on the canopy-covered lodges. Behind them, a collection of heads suggest a crowd of figures. On the left-hand side, a youthful god with the globe of the world in his hand, blessing with the other, is seated. Next to him, the archangel Michael, and beside this group, musicians with a portable organ and horns. On the right, the mouth of hell, gaping open, guarded by the dog-faced Cerberus, above whom, on the rightmost platform, Lucifer directs his minions. The kind of post-photographic reality fallacy that I described a few minutes ago, that's becoming enhanced, I think, with PowerPoint, was performed in the pages of the journal Medieval English Theatre in the late 1990s. Graham Reynolds and Gordon Kipling debated the question, is this a picture of a medieval theater or of a Roman theater? Reynolds argued that what we see is a scene from a contemporary performance of a mystery play of the life of Saint Apollonia, taking place in a medieval theater. As additional backup, he refers to a printed text that appears in the inventory of a bookseller in Tours under the title Saint Apollonia. And what's more, as he says, Jean Fouquet, the illuminator, was a man of the theater, making it likely that he would have been involved in the said production, seen it, and then painted it. Kipling countered that the artist instead relied on textual descriptions of the Roman theater to imagine and then paint this picture. It represents a Roman theater. The descriptions to which Kipling refers appear in texts by Tertullian and Isidore, which provide a moralizing commentary on the dangers of the theater. And according to Kipling, the picture conveys a similar moralizing critique of theater. A third recent article by Véronique Dominguez asks the question, why did the artist include a depiction of a theater in a book of hours? Dominguez introduces a crucial point absent in the debate. This picture is not isolated, but formed part of a devotional book. But what all of these arguments share is the assumption that this painted miniature depicts a theater, although they come out with different conclusions as to which theater the picture represents. Now, I want to interject here that these are really important and subtle scholars on this period of performance in 15th century mystery play texts, and they've engaged in massive research. And it's exciting to read a real debate in the pages of a journal. But the terms of this debate reify and reinforce the idea that there was such a thing as a medieval theater, a building constructed to house plays, that this medieval theater is a structure that can be represented, characterized, and identified. And this is the idea I want to work against tonight. The picture evokes and combines two separate performance traditions, but not in the ways the authors suggest. First, I want to think through the connections between this picture and the theater of antiquity. To do so, I turn to another picture. Here, we're looking at the frontispiece of the first 15th century Parisian manuscript of Terence's comedies in French translation, which was given to John of Berry as a New Year's present in 1407. Theatrum is inscribed at the center of the upper edge of the wall that forms the circular enclosure housing the event. This building sits amongst rows of houses, and men enter it through openings pierced through its walls. A box-like structure at the center of the enclosure, labeled scena, is curtained on at least 3 sides. The front curtain is raised to reveal Calliopeus, who reads from a codex. Emerging from the side of the scena is a masked performer. Grouped around this structure is the audience, identified as the populace Romanus, which intermingles with the other masked performers identified as gesticulatores. Here they are. The inscriptions are clues that the illuminators and their advisors relied on Isidore of Seville's description of the elements of the Roman theater and the vocabulary that defines it. Other details suggest that Tertullian's additional details in his description of the theater, which for Tertullian was a moralizing critique, was not far from their minds. The wild, exuberant, exaggerated gestures and dynamic motions of the performers create a coordinated dance, a semicircle which creates a rhythm around the central platform. In a detail that can be read as a literalization of Tertullian's association of the theater with sexual promiscuity, or perhaps as an interpretation of accounts of the phallic masks of Roman comedy, or finally as a comment on the sexual content of Terence's comedies, these masked performers reveal here what is either their genitals or a mask covering and resembling them. The picture also emphasizes the proximity between the Roman theater and houses of prostitution. A fashionably dressed man leaves the theater building. He is either propositioned by the older figure in blue with their hand on his arm, or is himself a prostitute. A similar pair of figures appears below. The addition of these figures might allude to the sexual exchange associated, following Tertullian, with the location of the theater building and the cultural practice that took place within it. Similar features appear in the woodcut included in the earliest printed Terence, produced in Lyon in 1493. As in Jean de Berry's manuscript that we just looked at, a picture of a theater precedes the first comedy. In the Lyon print, the audience sits in rows facing the stage, framed by the proscenium. It also calls attention more directly to the sexual promiscuity associated with this performance tradition. The exterior wall of this building identifies it as a theatrum, below which appears the word fornices. Fornices can mean arches and would in this sense refer to the architectural foundation of the theater's physical structure. However, another meaning of fornices, which we've inherited, invoked by both Tertullian and Isidore, was brothel. The amorous couples that move around the lower level of the building illustrate the function of fornices in this sense. Consequently, the Lyon print underscores the association between the theater and commercial sex, assumed in one of the medieval meanings of theater as brothel. These pictures establish that a theatrum is a building designed for performances and an object that can be represented. The print establishes in turn a spatial distinction between the area reserved for the performance and one for the audience. These pictures, among others prefacing Terence's comedies, helped maintain the legacy of a particular antiquarian vision of the spatial configuration of the theater of antiquity. Now let's go back to Santa Apollonia. The carefully coordinated, exuberant dance of the performers in the Jean of Berry manuscript recall those of Apollonia's torturers, while their distribution in a semicircle around Calliopeus, above here, echoes the vortex the figures form around the saint's body. The amorous couples in the platforms on the right evoke the scenes of and reference to lovemaking in the Terence frontispieces. Here in this detail above, the figures kissing in the back. The figure in blue might reference Calliopeus, reading the text as performer's gesture, and the fool who reveals his backside also picks up on the details in the Terence frontispiece. But here in this detail, it's certainly not a mask that resembles the figure's genitals. It is clearly depicted here. We see the transparent underwear that he's wearing. His breeches have been hoisted down, the string that once held them together dangling, and what we see clearly, his testicles and penis behind. The combination of the fool and the figure reading the codex reappears in a miniature that dates to just after the Santa Apollonia figure, in a representation of the rape of the Sabines in a manuscript of Livy. This pairing that we see here, figure in blue and the fool next to him, is therefore associated with a pictorial tradition of the Roman theater. But the point that I want to underscore here is that the antiquarian idea of theater as building that we see in the Terence frontispieces made possible Fouquet's picture. The artist of the St. Apollonia miniature relied on the configuration of Roman theater transmitted through other pictures to conceptualize a performance taking place. Interlocking platforms create the walls of an impermeable structure. The continued contours of this barrier are suggested by the polygonal shape of the structure in the upper register and the boundary created by the semicircular hedge and trellis below. As we could in the antiquarian spatial configuration of Terence's theater, we are able to see here an enclosure to house a performance. Adopting the separation between audience and performers in the Terence print, the artist positions the Martyrdom of St. Apollonia before an audience, a privileged viewer, one who, like us, as the viewer of the manuscript page, views the saint's martyrdom front on. The artist, Etienne Chevalier, and we, the viewers, see the performance as if we were sitting in the front row. Fouquet's antiquarian vision of theater was contemporized. So, to move to the second part, I want to now think through the ways the picture incorporates elements from a second performance tradition, one contemporary with its making, that of large-scale urban drama. Performances that took place over a series of days and increased in complexity over the long 15th century. For these performances, scaffolding or wagons were arranged in and around the central marketplace in the city or in a neighboring open area. The relationship between individual scaffoldings and the ground for action varied according to the circumstances. So this has been referred to as place and scaffolding, but this terminology is deceptive because it makes it seem as if these were fixed locations. The way they were arranged differed at different times of the performance, and also according to the particular city and landscape. Indeed, the Martyrdom of St. Apollonia hints at this kind of arrangement. The frieze of figures in the back occupies wooden platforms differentiated based on the shape of their canopies and curtains. These platforms serve for spectators, performers, and to stand for a location or place in the action. The throne of the imperial realm in the center, and the heavenly realm on the left, and hell on the right. The exquisite hell mouth and the attention paid to detail in it parallels the attention to this element of contemporary performance. Hell mouths were crafted at great expense and with complex machinery for these occasions. The picture also hints at the interaction between spectators and participants in the action, a defining feature of these performances. The loge at the center containing the emperor's throne is empty, but a ladder would allow him to return to his seat from where he performs before. The angels guarding God's realm with their arms crossed are seated on a stepped plank posed against the scaffold. The devils that punctuate the composition are reminiscent of the devil's capacity to move between performers and spectators in these performances. They would hop off scaffolding, run around spectators, or alternately whisper in the ear of executioners, pagans, or Judas, egging him on to take his own life. The painted devils here evoke such a permeability of the spatial divisions between audience and performers. The burnished gold coloring of those standing on the ground, here on the right, places them both against the realm of the spectators and within the realm of the performers. The gray-black devils expand into the scene of torture. One lays their hand on the back of the tormentor who grasps Apollonia's hair, breathing directions into his ear. And another crops up, hovering behind the emperor. In these performances, the fool also performed a transgressive role. In this picture, here he turns his head as if to address the figures to his side, but his rear end and the sound it suggests is directed at the viewer. The devil's repeated presence in this picture and the fool's obscene gesture might be related to a moralizing critique of the theater of antiquity. Indeed, Tertullian characterized it as the realm of the devil. Within a prayer book like this, the ultimate goal would be to focus the viewer's attention on the saint, to reflect both on the saint's sacrifice in Christ's name and in imitation of his passion, and on the viewer's complicity in Christ's death. And this might be one way that we can read the executioner who looks out of the picture at us, acknowledging our complicity in his action. It would then follow that the antiquarian idea of theater was garnered to express an added humiliation and torment to the saint, that is, that she was turned into a spectacle. But these figures are so clearly evocative of the roles of the fool and the devils in textual evidence for late medieval performances that it is also within this performance tradition that the picture should be seen. But as the Santa Apollonia miniature so effectively updates the purpose-built structure of the antiquarian idea of theater, lining the walls of the polygon-shaped enclosure with references to a contemporary performance tradition, it distorts this very tradition. To describe it as a picture of medieval theater neglects three fundamental aspects of this performance tradition. First, it doesn't capture the spatial experience of such performances, their vastness and variety, the ways they engaged spectators and interacted with the urban environment. A picture cannot recreate this experience. Now, in order to hammer home this point, I thought it would be useful to interject a quick discussion of two other pictures that you see here. So what we see are two diagrammatic sketches of the setting for a passion play performed in the city of Luzern in Switzerland in 1583. I suggest that they do a pretty good job of showing or alluding to the varied and flexible spatial dynamic that the arrangements of scaffolding or wagons could produce. The drawings were composed by the municipal clerk who oversaw the production, a man by the name of Renward Zizat. The drawings present detailed ground plans of the market square in the city during 2 different days of the performance. The indicators of specific places, buildings, or monuments are identified by the extensive inscriptions and locate the geographic or architectural site in which different events took place. Resembling folded down images in a pop-up book for children, these visual references provide a bird's eye perspective on the different places for the action within the performance. Clearly discernible, for instance, if I turn the images around, easier to see on the top right of each picture, is the hellmouth, signaling the realm of Satan. And in this case, it is a discrete structure that protrudes into the square. The temple building, now upside down, you can see it here and here, in Jerusalem appears in both of the drawings. Heaven is situated before the city hall, here again upside down. Turn to a detail of the first one here, before the city hall, whose turrets, windows, and flags stand out in the plans. And the inscription here reads heaven, the eternal Father, and the 7 angels. But this detail here is also a good example of how the arrangement of these sites changed on each performance day. On the first day, and that's the detail that you see here, the Garden of Eden and Mount Sinai are positioned before the facade of the city hall below heaven. On the other day, we see the Mount of Olives and the 3 crosses. The sites are similarly changed when we move into the square here on the first day, where we see the brazen serpent and the golden calf, and on the other day, to move to a detail of the second picture, the tree located where Judas committed suicide here, and the crosses, as we saw. The fabricated structures indicating places, buildings, or monuments are not situated around the periphery of a central playing area, although in part they are, but they also populate both the edges and the middle of the market square. As the action moved between these locations, it related individual structures situated across and diagonally from each other. Furthermore, the drawings belie any neat division between the outer limits of the performance created by a series of scaffolding and a central playing area. The fabricated structures at the periphery and those closer to the center of the square are on the same level, and there's no center to this playing area. Consequently, the action was not equally perceptible from points around a center, but agglomerated around one side of the market area. Finally, as we move from one drawing to the next, we become aware of the transformation of the setting from one day of performance to another. The structures that housed and framed the action, as well as their relationship to individuals participating in and observing the play, varied on each day of the performance. So this means that this performance was site-specific, not generalizable. The copious inscriptions that span the surface of each plan identify the distinct components of the staging of the play, rather than masking the contemporary facades and structures in the city's marketplace. The drawings retain identifiable references to the everyday function of the buildings that serve as backdrop for the action. Moving downwards on the left, I don't have a detail and I won't go through it, but we see the reference to a courthouse, the house of the town clerk, the apothecary, and Sebastian Krab's house. And on the right, we see your Kramer's house, the butcher's shop, and the house of the late mayor, Helen. The juxtaposition of references to the sites of the imaginary world of the play with those to the everyday world of the city created a viewing environment that was, for the duration of the performance, both Jerusalem and Lucerne. This concern to accurately preserve the staging relates to the function of the plans as both potential models for a future production of the Passion Play and also as commemorative accounts of an event in the city's history. We're not led to believe that we are seeing the staging in the way in which we would have seen the actual performance, nor are we inclined to generalize from these pictures. They cannot stand in as an illustration of late medieval mystery plays, and neither can the Saint Apollonia miniature. The second problem with an investment in this miniature as a representation of medieval theater is that it neglects the range of performances that make up the theatrical culture of the time. So mystery or passion plays were just one type. Artists, as I said in my introduction, participated in a range of types of performances. And I want to keep this brief because I've written a whole book on it. So I'm going to stick with the picture at hand and the name of the artist with which it has been associated, Jean Fouquet. So remember that part of Runnels' argument that this is a medieval theater is that Jean Fouquet was a man of the theater. The Jean Fouquet of Tours, who appears in the municipal accounts, was involved in a range of performances. 3 of them appear in the municipal records in the city. So, and this suggests the kind of performances that an artist like this would have participated in. So Jean Fouquet was enlisted to help design the figural groupings on scaffolding that was erected on along the main street of the city when King Louis XI made his entry into Tours. The project was never carried out because the king decided that he didn't want to come. However, Jean Fouquet appears in the municipal records again for a second entry into the city, that of the Portuguese king Alfonso V. And for this occasion, he was paid to paint the interior of the canopy that covered the king's chariot as he came into the city. Finally, the last reference that appears for Jean Fouquet is when Charles VII's death mask was transported from Paris to Tours to be painted by Jean Fouquet. So in looking at these references, we can see what kinds of performances Jean Fouquet was involved in. It's not large-scale urban drama, but what these references also suggest is the range of kinds of performances that made up a late medieval theatrical culture and in which artists were involved. A third and perhaps obvious problem with describing this picture as a representation of medieval theater is that the aspects of one late medieval performance tradition that it evokes, large-scale urban drama, have come to stand for the entire period we call the Middle Ages. Even more aligned with an anachronistic conception of the spatial experience of medieval performance is our second example. It's the picture most often used to illustrate the staging of late medieval drama. Again and again, it appears as a shorthand for the stage. And just to show you some examples, this is a model that was constructed for the World's Fair that in the 19th century that is still in the Opera of Paris. You can go and see it here for a general study of medieval theater in context, and then here on the cover of Nagler's The Medieval Religious Stage. So this picture makes a good book cover. As in the case of the Saint Apollonia miniature, it's been extracted from the book in which it was bound. The picture is the frontispiece to an illuminated manuscript on paper containing a script of the word spoken and a description of the action of a performance of the life of Mary and the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, which took place, this performance took place in the city of Valenciennes in 1547. The event that took place in Valenciennes is a good example of the explosion in scale of urban performances that began during the first third of the 16th century. The standard length of these performances had commonly been 3 or 4 days. In Valenciennes, the story unfolded over a period of 25 days, during which the action moved between geographically dispersed sites. According to an inscription spanning the upper edge, it represents the theater or platform as it was when the Passion of our Lord was performed in Valenciennes in 1547. A local painter, Hubert Caillot, made this drawing 30 years after the citizens of Valenciennes financed, organized, and participated in a production, this production lasting 25 days. The picture portrays in vibrant and exuberant colors the grandiose machinery. Here, a detail of the hellmouth, the multi-story contraptions, here with heaven posed above the building, and the juxtaposition of geographically distant places. So in this detail, we can see Nazareth next to the temple in Jerusalem, the door into the city on the right, and the palace next to that. The Golden Gate is positioned next to that. We also see an opposition between heaven on the left and hell on the right. The drawing highlights the violent body antics of colorful, costumed devil figures. In so doing, the picture evokes the multisensory impact of these performances, which is a crucial component of the experience they prompted. The complex machinery emitting smoke and flames that produced these effects was expensive and became the object of specialized knowledge transmitted from one generation to the next. God and his terrestrial representatives and the devil and his legions were involved in much of the action, as we see in this frontispiece. Flying angels and smoke-breathing devils populated. That the picture appears as a frontispiece before the written summary and dialogue of each day and the other illuminations that accompany the text suggests that the platform or theater and the inscription is an unchanging backdrop to the play in its entirety. Its placement at the beginning of the manuscript suggests that these sites remain stable components of the scenery and action throughout the duration of the performance. However, we only need to note the absence of key locations in the Passion narrative, Golgotha or the Mount of Olives, to assume that our view of the sites at which the events transpired is partial. The sheer number of place marks mentioned in the text that follows and included in the sequence of 25 illuminations corresponding with each day of the performance belies the claim made in the inscription above the frontispiece that it depicts what we would call a stage in its entirety. Moreover, the picture distorts the fundamental spatial configuration of the performance tradition it commemorates. To insist one more time, performances like the Valenciennes Passion play did not take place in a building designed for that purpose, but outside in market squares or in large courtyards. Rather than remaining on a fixed stage, actors moved between a series of platforms and a central area where they intermingled with spectators. To give you a little more description of the scale and format of these platforms, and to make clear that they varied based on the occasion and the location at which the performance took place. According to the contemporary description of the entry of the Prince Philip the Good into Ghent, which displayed the same theme as that of the city's well-known altarpiece, the Ghent altarpiece, the scaffolding was 3 stories high and measured 50 feet in length and 28 feet across. An anonymous burgher's account of a royal entry into Paris reports that the series of platforms on which the Passion was performed stretched to 100 feet in length. The account books, another very valuable source for the Passion play performed in Mons, also specify the dimensions of the scaffolding constructed to house the various locations in which the action of the play would take place, structural elements that spanned around the periphery of the market square in the city. And what stands out in all of these really important documents is that the wooden constructions made to house these diverse performances, that these wooden constructions were multiple. The action took place on a series of structures, on stages, if you will, but not on a stage. But here, when we look at the picture, the depiction of the platform as single and self-sufficient already limits the space on which the events were performed. The two-dimensional surface of the picture plane and the thick black border around its edges reinforce this delimitation of the playing area. The bracketing of the stage with hell on the right and heaven on the left imposes a general interpretation of the play as a contest between good and evil. The drawing slices the stage or theater from its urban environment and places it against the white background of the pages of paper. At the same time that the picture demonstrates that something called a stage or theater can be named and depicted, it makes this definable and fixed entity the site of a large-scale urban production. In turn, it positions the viewer of the picture and by implications, the spectator of the play at the center and in front of this structure. The drawing envisions the 1547 performance through the lens of what is for us a more familiar playgoing experience. The picture has therefore endorsed a particular understanding of a medieval stage, one that assumes a fixed platform upon which the action took place, below and in front of which the audience would sit or stand. And it has enabled this narrative by the way the picture condenses and distorts the Valenciennes performance. So to conclude, what are the takeaways from this close looking exercise about understanding the very small number of pictures that have been used to illustrate medieval theater? First, it is through the lens of the Santa Apollonia miniature and the Valenciennes frontispiece that medieval theater has been illustrated. Within this framework, the pictures represent two options available to contemporary organizers. Along this theory, Fouquet presents what was identified as the medieval theater in the round. The Valenciennes frontispiece depicts its linear platform stage. The two pictures we've looked at are important to our history of medieval theatricality, but they do not contribute to it in the direct evidentiary way that theater historians have sometimes assumed. I would like you to bring a critical eye to the limits and distortions such pictures create, and always acknowledge what we miss about this theatrical tradition when we identify pictures like this as being of the medieval theater. In crucial ways, in fact, they obscure our understanding of what was unique, strange, and exciting about the variety of performances that took place during the 15th and 16th centuries. In churches, in courts, and on city streets and squares. It is to other types of pictures, like the Lucerne drawings I showed, that we might turn for a vestige of the spatial contours of a late medieval performance tradition, which is the second point that I would like you to leave with. As the images that I look at in the book that Justine mentioned, which includes tableaux vivants, manuscript illuminations, and tapestries, these other types of visual artifacts physically engage their audience in ways that parallel what historians of medieval drama have identified as its distinctive features, including the lack of a strictly delimited and fixed playing area and the overlap between areas reserved for players and those reserved for the audience. And my final point, the final takeaway here, has to do with the kind of close looking that we've been doing. I articulated my concern about the prevalence of PowerPoint and its role in the transmission and construction of knowledge about pictures. But I also want to put a positive spin on our current use of technology. Our reliance on the screen has made us all the more aware of the insufficiency of a medium, Zoom, to communicate ideas and with one another. However, it might also have equipped us with the ability to fill in some of the gaps by recalling what it's like to meet in person, to communicate as living bodies in space. And I'm looking forward to that moment. So perhaps applying what we've learned from this Zoom experience that we've all been through, it might help us recognize the insufficiency of pictures in frames like the Santa Apollonia miniature and the Valenciennes frontispiece, and perhaps to take them as a starting point from which to creatively reimagine the experiential viewing of medieval performances. So I hope that that's something that you'll take from my talk today. And I'm certainly happy to answer your questions or respond to your comments.
Thank you so much, Laura. Dr. Weigert, that was a really wonderful, incredibly rich story starter for how to think about these images and really what the actual theater experience was. So as Dr. Weigert said, feel free to put a question in the Q&A as you're formulating them, as you're kind of chewing on the all the bits that she gave us to think about. I loved the very close looking of the examples that you gave us, especially the first image from the Book of Hours with Saint Apollonia. That was just a wonderful way to go through that image so carefully. I'll start off with a question while we wait for people to kind of think about what they might want to ask. You've mentioned the tableau vivant, and I don't really know enough about that tradition. Can you define that for our audience and kind of, I'm sure there's lots you could say, but connect it a little bit with the distinctions between theater itself?
Thank you. Yeah, and in fact, that term slipped into my talk, and it's a term that I think it does not accurately capture the type of performance that it has been used to describe. So I'll explain why. But figures on stages became part of the facets of entry processions, and increased in complexity, and incredible resources were devoted to these performances that combined both human figures and inanimate figures to convey different events in honor of the ruler, in honor of the city. So this type of performance was an extremely important facet of the long 15th century, because it combined both animate and inanimate figures. That's one of the reasons that the term tableau vivant is not accurate. And the other reason is that tableau vivant assumes from its later post 18th century lineage that these performances relied on a painting as their source. And in fact, in many cases, it was quite the opposite, but it's beside the point in a way. If we take the example of the Ghent altarpiece, a painting that maybe many of you know, there was also a similar theme that was performed for Philip the Good, but there was clearly an exchange between the two, the painting and the staging, but the staging was not relying on the painting as its model. So this type of performance was a key aspect of civic performances and those performances that cities put on in honor of their participants. It's very difficult to reconstruct because there are some textual references, but the descriptions are very short. And the first pictorial description, the first picture that we have, dates to the 1490s, and that's a manuscript that was made in honor of the entry of Joanna of Castile into Brussels. And it's an incredibly detailed and intricate manuscript that gives us a sense of what these stages looked like and the way in which they involved both human and inanimate figures and the kinds of themes that were depicted. So this is a tradition that has always been referred to as tableau vivant, and I tend to not use that term, but you caught me. It slipped into the lecture despite myself. That's why theater slips in a lot when I'm trying to get away from that as well.
Right. I think of that too, though. I think that's why I caught on to it, because I've never been quite clear about the tableau vivant tradition, thinking of it as a kind of later tradition. And so I was surprised to think of it in a medieval context. But what you've said kind of leads into a question from Dr. Timothy Graham. He's asking, do you think there was a direct influence in both directions between late medieval dramatic performances and the kinds of civic spectacles associated with Dukes of Burgundy in the long 15th century?
I guess, could you repeat that? Because
Sure. So he's asking if there's an influence between dramatic performances, like I think the plays, the moralizing plays, and then the civic spectacle. So maybe what is the relationship between civic spectacle and theater, play, that kind of thing.
Right. Well, so the first thing to say is that they involved the same groups. It was the same individuals who were involved in both, and that's why I hesitated in terms of responding to the question, to define one as urban drama and the other as spectacle is in fact drawing a distinction between two forms of performance that so much overlapped at the time. And just for one example, this idea of the scaffoldings, the same scaffolding would be used for the different sites or to house the spectators in the performance of a passion play, and then reused for a religious procession through the town. So the same material artifacts that were constructed, crafted by city guilds, members of the city were reused, and the same individuals were part of both the performances and the financing and the details of these. So yes, absolutely. This is part of a broad sort of broadening expansion of the elaborate nature of performances of all kinds that happened during this long 15th century. So thank you for that question, and I hope that it clarifies. This is one of the idea that expanding the definition of drama at the time to talk about performance culture more generally moves us away from defining medieval theater as a kind of drama that included a script with roles. And this is also one of the points that Carol Symes was making, that when we expand this definition of performance culture, a lot of different things are brought in. But it's true that in the period, this 15th century that I've been looking at, these elaborate, large-scale urban performances took place in a variety of venues and engaged the same individuals.
Excellent. So definitely with your talk and Carol Symes' talk, we're getting this sense of this much more expansive definition of what medieval theater is compared to the very strict kind of parameters we put on it in a contemporary modern context. So I'm definitely seeing that. Timothy Peterson is asking, he says a simplistic question, but I think a vital one. How are the large-scale multi-day urban dramas resourced, and who funded them? So how do they pay for all these things, and who gets paid?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, the case of Valenciennes is really interesting, because there you see the kinds of urban resources that went into this 25-day performance that was funded in part by the Duke living in the city, but also by the burghers in the city. Now, not in the case of Valenciennes, but in many instances, the performances were paying, so that payment was collected in order to view the performance. So that was an additional source of revenue. But these are urban spectacles that were financed by the municipal civic authorities. And this is one of also the important points, that these are the civic spectacles are ones that are part of their civic identity. So when the dukes are entering into the city, in fact, it's the city that is presenting itself and also financing their productions.
Right. So when you say the viewers paid as well, was it like a pass the hat kind of thing, you think, rather than a ticketed event, or could be either?
So Graham Runnels, who was an amazing scholar, has collected a lot of information about this point, and not tickets, but there was a payment entering into the location that was required for in certain cases, as in the case of Mons that he talks about.
Okay, perfect. If anyone else has a question, please feel free to type it in. I'll fill in a gap though. I'm interested in this Jean Fouquet character because we often fail to think about the breadth that artists worked within, right? And the different kind of media and the different kinds of things they were capable of and asked to do in the Middle Ages. And I'm wondering, do we have any sense of how many of other persons working in this manner? How many types of artists? I don't know what I'm asking exactly. I guess, was there a guild which covered all of this, or was there, is there any way to know numbers of artists that were working in any particular place at one time?
Well, I think for the 15th century, the names of artists who we recognize in a 15th century survey, a Northern Renaissance survey of art history, many of them were involved not just in the production of panel paintings, but also the painting for festivities that were put on both in cities and at courts. So I would respond to that question is that, you know, who didn't, in a way.
Okay.
So Roger Vanderbide and Jan van Eyck, these are individuals who were involved in different the production of different performance events and different kinds of art making practices. The question of the guild is also interesting because these kinds of performances would involve both members of the Rhetoricians Guild and the Painters Guild. So it was a moment in which those two guilds came together, and the Painters Guild painting was a category that encompassed a range of what we would define as separate media, but would necessarily mean that artists were moving between the media that we now separate into panel painting and other types of painting.
Right. So you focused here on the manuscripts and said that this is the way that medieval or theater history of the Middle Ages, I guess, have kind of explored this. Is it just the fact that these screens and scaffoldings and things were understood to be ephemeral and temporary, that we don't have that kind of material to look at? Or is there any painted sources of wooden beams, or I think maybe tapestries that may have survived from actual performances? Is that even possible?
Well, that's, I mean, I mentioned the first pictorial account of the stagings, those things that are not tableau vivant, for Joanne of Castile. And this is a very interesting case in which it's clear that the painters of this manuscript are emphasizing the planks and the beams and the nitty-gritty construction of these scaffoldings, but those appear in the pictures. They're not referenced in the text. So in that particular case, which is a really unusual and the only one of that case, it's it provides an insight into those aspects of the stagings, but often what happens is that they fall out, that detail of kind of meta discourse on the scaffolding falls out, and the pictures retain only the subject matter of what was represented. So there are pictures, and we can figure out, and this is what art historians have often done, that these scenes were staged at the entry of a particular duke or duchess. However, the pictures themselves mask any reference to the constructions and become pictures. So in terms of the actual, you're right, these were ephemeral events. They were, the structures were reused, the costumes were reused, but the performance itself was either a one-off or in the cases of these repeated performances, when they needed to rebuild or reweave costumes, then they would do that, and the things would disappear. So, but I think the point here too is that even if we did have one structure, even if we did have some more detailed material evidence, the performances were, as any performances, really required all of the different elements to come together to be legible, to be experienced.
Perfect. That has my mind reeling. But Timothy Graham has another really great comment question. He asks, some of the grotesques in the margins of the Latrell Psalter apparently represent machines used in theatrical performances. Are there marginal illustrations in other late medieval manuscripts that might reflect the performance tradition?
Yeah, well, I think, and again, that's a great question, and it allows me to insist on this point that there was incredible interaction in terms of a pictorial vocabulary, in terms of references between what would have been seen and what populated the margins of manuscripts or panel paintings. Whether we want to argue that the marginal illuminations in the Latrell Psalter are a representation of those performances, that's a step that one wouldn't want to make. They are engaging a similar vocabulary, but it's very difficult to determine whether there's a distance. What is a depiction of a hellmouth, and what is a depiction of a representation or an artifice, a machine of a hellmouth? So that's a question, a real challenge for pictorial imagery, and also something that I think we should hesitate before we assume that it's a representation of a machine, as opposed to that direct reference to the hellmouth as idea, as symbol, as narrative content.
That's a great point. Just a quick comment from Tony Matson. He says, one of the most enlightening portions of your talk was the city clerk's 2-page, 2-day graphics of the various locations. In addition to the paintings you showed, it gave him a good idea of the interactions with the audience and the movement of the production. And he just thanks you. He's coming from, he says, a layman's point of view. We're all laymen in the end, but thank you, Tony. And Dennis McCarthy is asking, when did any play resembling a modern play with actors, even for a small audience, first appear? For example, the plays The Thing in Which I'll Catch the Conscience of the King kind of performance?
Well, so yes, that I'll back up and answer this, because it is a big question. When did medieval theater start? The relationship between an oral tradition and a tradition that was written down. So the first vernacular play with the names of characters and a certain amount of description. It's probably, we'll hear about it tomorrow from Kyle Thomas, the play of Adam in the 12th century, a play that includes many of those elements. And this is not to say that plays that capture the idea of characters and script didn't exist before, but they weren't preserved. So it's really late that we have this first object, this first artifact that is preserved. And then in the 15th century, we have an explosion of texts that capture the kind of elements that we can call a play script, dialogue and stage directions. But this tradition was one that existed. It's the moment when it becomes recorded that changes. So there are very few of these manuscripts that predate the third quarter of the 15th century. The macro manuscript, for instance, with the Castle of Perseverance diagram is, and we tend to forget this, it was, that manuscript dates to about 1440. So we're moving into the 15th century before we have textual evidence and artifacts that point to that. What I think you're saying refers to a kind of play as we would define it.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you, Dr. Weigert. What you've done, I feel, for us tonight is really help us envision this kind of invisible thing, or re-envision it into something closer to what how it actually was experienced. So thank you for that. And I think we'll look forward to tomorrow night with Kyle Thomas to kind of put it together in another way, and how we actually bring all those elements that you said together into staging a performance like this. Thank you so much for being here with us and kicking off our second week, our last two lectures at the Helen Damico Memorial Lecture Series. And I'll leave it to you to have the last word.
Sure. Well, I want to thank everybody for coming to listen tonight, and I'm really excited at the number of people who are interested in things medieval, and to thank you, Justina, again for an evening without technical flaws.
We're lucky. Well, thank you so much. Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you tomorrow. Remember that the Zoom room opens at 5 and audience will be let into the place at just before 5:30. So we'll see you tomorrow night. Thanks, everyone. Thank you so much, Dr. Weigert. Bye.